Hi, I'm A.J. DeRosa, the founder of Project Upland, and I have used the onX Hunt app for over a decade. But what I respect most is what onX is doing for public lands. From their access and stewardship program, to the public lands reports, to their partnership with Pheasants Forever PATH, public access to habitat program, they're not just talking the talk, they're investing in real, boots on the ground impact. They're opening gates, defending access, and making sure future generations have a place to hunt. That's why I'm proud to have them present the Project Upland Podcast series. To learn more and support their effort, go to onxmaps.com and click on Access Initiatives. Thanks for listening. Have you ever wondered what the state of the birds in North America is? Are they doing okay? Or are things not looking so great? Turns out there's a document out there that comes out every few years called the State of the Birds Report to tell us just that.
The report covers every region of the United States. It's basically a comprehensive check-in as to how the birds are doing. And after AJ and I read this year's report, we had a ton of questions. We also wanted to share this information with the broader Project Upland audience because we think it's something everyone who loves birds would be interested in.
We talked to Dr. Mike Brasher, a senior waterfowl scientist with Ducks Unlimited and co-chair for the State of the Birds Report's Science Committee. He told us about the significance of the report in the scientific community, how much effort went into creating the report, and what would happen if research like this lost its federal funding.
Before we dive in much deeper, let's first explore how people began collecting data on birds at the turn of the 20th century. That's when the first Christmas bird counts were conducted, which is crazy because that means in 2025, we're celebrating 125 years of the Christmas bird count. That's 125 years of regular people deciding to collect data on birds.
My name is AJ DeRosa, co-host of the Project Upland Podcast and founder of Project Upland.
And I'm Gabby Zaldumbide, the editor-in-chief of Project Upland Magazine and AJ's co-host.
This podcast series is an immersive experience that travels through time, stretches across landscapes, and delivers on the independent storytelling you have come to love.
Listen in as we learn from researchers, biologists, and subject matter experts about birds, nature, conservation, dogs, and more. This is a glimpse into the crazy minds of the folks at Project Upland and the stories that do not always make it to print.
A simple action like rating, reviewing, and subscribing has a huge impact on our small business. If you want to support our independent media further, head over to our Patreon, where you will find behind-the-scenes content, full-length interviews, resources, and even interact with us.
Join us as we travel into the deepest, most obscure, and nerdiest realms of the uplands.
These are your stories.
It is not many years ago that sportsmen were accustomed to meet on Christmas Day, choose sides, and then, as representatives of the two bands resulting, hie them to the fields and woods on the cheerful mission of killing practically everything in fur or feathers that crossed their path, if they could. These exceptional opportunities for winning the laurels of the chase were termed side hunts, and reports of the hundreds of non-game birds which were sometimes slaughtered during a single hunt were often published in our leading sportsmen's journals with perhaps a word of editorial commendation for the winning side. We are not certain that the side hunt is wholly a thing of the past, but we feel assured that no reputable sportsman's journal of today would venture to publish an account of one unless it were to condemn it. And this very radical change of tone is one of the significant signs of the times. Now, bird lore proposes a new kind of Christmas side hunt in the form of a Christmas bird census, and we hope that all our readers who have the opportunity will aid us in making it a success by spending a portion of Christmas Day with the birds and sending a report of their hunt to Bird Lore before they retire that night. Such reports should be headed by the locality, hour of starting and of returning, character of the weather, direction and force of the wind, and the temperature, the latter taken when starting. The birds observed should then be added, following the order in which they are given in the AOU checklist, with, if possible, the exact or approximate number of individuals of each species observed. Frank M. Chapman in Bird Lore, 1900, Volume 2, Issue 6.
The first Christmas bird count took place on December 25, 1900, after being promoted by ornithologist Frank M. Chapman in a publication called Bird Lore. Bird Lore became the Audubon magazine in 1941. During the first Christmas bird count, 27 birders conducted 25 counts and identified 89 bird species, and their locations ranged from Ontario to California. Species identified during the first count included ruffed grouse, greater prairie chickens, northern bobwhites, California quail, mallards, and many finches, warblers, vireos, wrens, and birds of prey.
The Christmas bird count has been going on for 125 years now, and today, it's not the only way the public can get involved with bird research. eBird is the most popular way the public shares and records information on birds. In fact, eBird has about 1 million users who have collected over 1.6 billion bird observations from around the world.
Additionally, the public isn't the only group of people counting birds. State wildlife agencies and federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have been conducting their own bird counts, like the drumming surveys ruffed grouse specialist Elena Roth talked about in a previous Project Upland podcast episode, and other breeding bird surveys for decades.
While the exceptionally fine weather on Christmas Day was a sufficient inducement to take one afield, we trust that the spirit of wholesome competition aroused by Bird Lore's bird census added materially to the pleasure of those who took part in it. The results of the census are both interesting and instructive. Interesting because they are definite, comparative, and, in a sense, personal. Instructive because they give a very good idea of the distribution of winter birds on Christmas Day, with some indication of the number of individuals which may be observed in a given time. On the one hand, the almost entire absence of such northern species as the crossbills is noticeable. On the other, the mild season and prevailing absence of snow evidently accounts for the presence of a number of species rarely observed in December. It has not been possible to publish all the notes which have been received, and it has been necessary to omit the descriptive matter which, in some instances, was given. At another time, we hope to suggest a bird census on somewhat more exact lines through the enumeration not of the birds observed on a given day, but of those occupying a certain area, when a description of the character of the ground, etc., will be of importance. A summary of the first Christmas bird count, Bird Lore, 1901, Volume 3, Issue 1.
To help us get a better understanding of how data can inform us about the status of a bird species population, Gabby and I talked to Mike Brasher, a senior waterfowl biologist with Ducks Unlimited. He told us about the history of bird counts and the importance of citizen participation in ornithology from the early 1900s until now. Today, all of this data collected by the public and by agencies are compiled as part of a massive project called the State of the Birds Report.
Mike Brasher, I'm a senior waterfowl scientist for Ducks Unlimited at our national headquarters in Memphis, Tennessee. I've worked for Ducks Unlimited for nearly 20 years now, and I've been involved with migratory bird science and conservation for a better part of that time, working in a variety of capacities in different locations. Worked along the Gulf Coast for about 13 years, and now at Ducks Unlimited's national headquarters. But even here, I'm able to work across pretty much all of North America with colleagues in the migratory bird profession, studying a lot of these birds and trying to figure out conservation solutions for their populations. I've been involved with the North American Bird Conservation Initiative for the past 4 or 5 years, and have had the pleasure of serving as one of the co-chairs of the State of the Birds Report Committee. So it's been a very rewarding experience to get to work with that group of scientists and researchers to assemble all this information to describe a snapshot of what's happening with America's birds.
The State of the Birds Report has been published every 2 or 3 years since 2012. It provides a snapshot of the status of different bird species across North America, which are grouped into different categories based on their habitats. Some of these categories include grassland birds, western forest birds, seabirds, and more, plus a special category called tipping point species, which we'll talk more about later. The people who put together this report are some of the most prominent ornithologists of our time.
Oh gosh, there were probably 30 to 40 leading avian scientists from really across North America. Although this report focuses on bird populations and trends in the U.S., we did have representation of scientists from other countries, Mexico and the U.S. And Canada. And many of these people have been in bird science and bird conservation for 3, 4, or more decades. They are some of our leading scientists, including colleagues from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Audubon, Bird Conservation of the Rockies, and a whole host of others, various state and federal agency representatives as well in some cases. And they're essentially the best of bird scientists representing the best of the best bird conservation organizations and agencies in America and North America, even larger than that. One of the neat aspects of this report and the effort that it takes to produce it is that it reminds us of the importance of collecting data to understand what's happening with America's birds. Without information, we're flying blind in terms of our understanding of what's happening to the birds that we love and that we love for many different reasons. And so that was one of the things that this report tried to emphasize was the value of data and different types of data. In particular, if folks check out the report, they will notice that there are some new maps that are produced through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's use of eBird. eBird is an application that folks can download on their phone, and they can participate in the collection of data based on the birds that they may see on a given day or a given period of time. That information is one example of a data set that's used to speak about sort of the trends in bird populations as they may differ across the landscape. In other words, identifying one part of a certain state or region where bird populations of a certain type are increasing versus another location where the bird populations are decreasing. And if you begin to understand where birds are increasing or decreasing, then you can better identify some of what may be causing those declines or increases, as we hope it may be in some cases. But other sources of data used in this report include something known as the Breeding Bird Survey. There's also a Christmas bird count survey that features prominently in some of this, along with other sort of professionally conducted, very well structured, long-running surveys of migratory bird populations. One of the best examples that we can point to in this report is the annual Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. Those data are used to help us understand on an annual basis the status and trend of duck populations. That information is used to help set harvest regulations for waterfowl. But in this case, those same data were used to help us report out in the State of the Birds report what we are learning and what we know about the trajectories of duck populations. So a whole host of data sets that are used to summarize our knowledge of bird populations.
In some cases, the data used to create this report goes back decades. Some of these data sets go back as far as the 1950s and the 1970s. This is pretty awesome because when you consider the State of the Birds report includes data from the early 2020s, this provides a really comprehensive look at the changes in bird populations over time via population indices. Since it's impossible to count every single bird in a population, using an index is the best way to track population changes.
It's important to remember that when we talk about trying to figure out the status of bird populations, of a bird population or a bird species, these are animals that Most of these are migratory in nature, which means they move long distances. Most of these have very large ranges, which means they can be found across vast areas. So it's virtually impossible to do a complete counting of all the individuals of a given bird species. It's a lot of times they're hard to see. You can't access all the areas where they are. And again, we're talking about many of these species occur across dozens of states, multiple countries, multiple provinces if we're talking about Canada. So what we do is we develop surveys that provide sort of a representative number of those birds across that area where we can find those birds. And then we conduct that same survey year after year after year. And if you conduct that same survey in the same way with standard protocols, then the numbers that you get from those successive years gives you an idea, an index of whether those bird populations are increasing, decreasing, or stable. There are also some, depending on how the survey is conducted, we can estimate the population size of different bird populations. And those, even in those instances, there's going to be some unknown level of birds that we probably haven't fully captured. But nevertheless, if you are conducting that survey and that estimation method, similarly, year after year after year, the most important thing is that you get an understanding of where the bird populations are increasing or decreasing. That's what's most important, is the understanding the trajectory, the trend of bird populations, so that it helps us identify, if you care about birds, those situations where bird populations are declining. And when we see declining bird populations, that means we have a concern, and that means we have to try to figure out through science and through other research endeavors what may be driving those declines. And then once we figure that out, we can hopefully try to develop and deliver the useful conservation solutions. And most of the time that conservation solution involves restoring, protecting, or enhancing the habitats that these birds depend upon. That's the one thing that all of these different data sets have told us, is that overwhelmingly it is the decline and decrease in the quality of habitat for these birds that is responsible for their population declines. The State of the Birds report has a category of bird species labeled tipping point species. These are species around which there is heightened urgency because of some fairly dramatic population declines that we've seen for these. And in particular, for a bird to make it into this tipping point category, their population will have declined by 50% or more over the past 50 years.
As Mike mentioned, many different groups of people collect, compile, and curate the State of the Birds report. Federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, many state wildlife agencies, universities, nonprofits, and even the greater public contribute to the data found in the report.
Ducks Unlimited is not directly involved as an organization in collecting any of this data. The individuals and agencies responsible for it are many and varied. There are a lot of state agencies that are involved in the collection of this information. There's a lot of federal agencies involved in the collection of this information and the curation of it as well. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plays a prominent role in collecting some of these data. The U.S. Geological Survey plays a prominent role in helping to curate and store and analyze some of these data. But a lot of the data sets that are featured in here are collected and supported through the efforts of ordinary folks like you and me, that whether we're talking about the Christmas bird count or the breeding bird survey, although there are established agencies and organizations that help oversee those, in a lot of cases they rely on people that are passionate about birds, that are great at bird identification, and that go out and conduct these surveys, providing that extra sort of participatory or citizen science, sort of crowdsourcing the collection of information, help us understanding what's happening with our wild bird populations. And then there's also the best example of that is Cornell Lab of Ornithology's eBird app, where anybody that downloads the app can go and observe birds and log their information in this app, and then Cornell has a team of scientists that have developed very sophisticated methods to maximize the value of that information that comes from so many different people all across the world. Really is now with the reach that they've achieved. So this report shows the results of massive amounts of data that are collected and stored, and it emphasizes the importance of having that information, because without knowledge of bird abundances and the status of bird populations, we can't effectively devise conservation solutions to ensure that we have healthy bird populations for our kids and grandkids and all those that come after us.
One really important thing worth mentioning about this data used in this report is its age. As we've learned from bird lore, the Christmas bird count began in the year 1900. Many state and federal wildlife agencies began collecting data on birds in the 1950s through the 1970s, and those same agencies, as well as universities and public citizens, continue to collect data today. This means the data used to measure changes in bird populations in the State of the Birds report spans across several decades.
The fact that this report references over 75 years of bird monitoring data is truly impressive. It really speaks to the scale and the longevity of avian research.
In past State of the Birds reports, waterfowl and waterbirds were the only groups that really showed population gains, with waterfowl showing the greatest increases. Duck populations are now 24% higher than they were in 1970, the result of foundational policies such as the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, Duck Stamp Program, and Conservation Title of the Farm Bill that have long safeguarded wetland resources and associated habitats. But today, this legacy is in jeopardy. State of the Birds Report, 2025.
A great way to better understand how important long-term data collection on birds is to look at how duck populations change over time. Obviously, ducks are tied to water, and as water levels in wetlands change, duck populations do too. If it weren't for long-term population monitoring, how else would researchers be able to measure how the amount of duck changes during periods of drought, or how quickly their numbers can rebound during years of high rainfall?
To me, one of the most interesting parts about the State of the Birds report are the eBird abundance trend maps. In them, color-coded dots are overlaid over a map of the United States, and the maps provide a very visual way to understand how bird populations are changing over time. Sticking with our duck example, in the dabbling and diving ducks map, a thin strip of light and dark blue spots cover eastern North and South Dakota, and the surrounding area is shrouded in red. The map shows how duck abundance is increasing in the blue area as it shrinks in the broader red area. And the report states that the map correlates with the loss of wetlands in the prairie pothole region.
What we've seen over the past 10 or so years is sort of deepening and persistent drought across the prairies, and that has led to a short-term decline in duck populations. Now, we do expect duck populations to recover whenever prairie wetlands, whenever rain returns to the prairies and wetlands start holding more water, sort of get resupplied with water. But we also know that we have continued to lose wetlands and lose grasslands in that really important landscape. And so this report and some of the other data give us an opportunity to see what our duck populations might look like if we lost those wetlands, lost those grasslands permanently, because a duck returning to the prairies really doesn't care if a wetland is dry because it's in the middle of drought or if it's dry because it has been drained. That's still a dry wetland to that duck that's returning to the prairies to breed. And so this allows us a lens through which to view these kind of darker future landscape scenarios and what it would mean for duck populations. So there are a number of other instances where we have seen some rebounds in certain bird populations.
This is Local 12 News on Star 64.
The 2025 State of the Birds report, about a third of all American bird species are considered a high or moderate concern. But maybe you're thinking, why should I care? Because a blow to birds is a blow to humans. Birds are critical for healthy ecosystems and economies. They help control pests, disperse seeds, and pollinate plants. They also generate nearly $280 billion a year for the U.S. economy through birding tourism and pest control.
Another important aspect of this report is its identification of tipping point species. The report defines these species as having lost more than 50% of their population within the past 50 years.
And there are 3 types of tipping point species: red, orange, and yellow. The yellow alert means that while these birds have experienced long-term population declines and they will benefit from continued conservation efforts, they've been relatively stable in recent years. The pinyon jay, the non-game bird Dr. Dave Dahlgren mentioned in the first episode of the Project Upland Podcast, is an example of a yellow alert species.
The orange alert birds are defined as birds showing long-term population losses and accelerated recent declines within the past decade. Many water birds, like whooping cranes, long-tailed ducks, and several species of gulls fall into this category.
Finally, the red alert is the most dire of the 3. Red alert birds are birds with perilously low populations and steep declining trends. 4 upland game birds, including the Gunnison sage-grouse, the greater sage-grouse, greater prairie chicken, and lesser prairie chicken, are red alert birds.
This should be alarming to us folks that are passionate about native game birds, as long-term trends of other species could be indication of a similar future trend. Think of the ruffed grouse, sharp-tailed grouse, and of course, the northern bobwhite quail.
Some of my colleagues and I talked about this as we were looking at this list, looking at the tipping point species list and asking, is there any single thing that is responsible for these birds? And the answer is there is no single factor. The overwhelming sort of common factor is a decline in habitat of some form or another, but that decline in habitat could take many different forms. It could be a decline in some of the resources provided by the areas that they occupy. It could be a total loss of the areas, at least in terms of it being sort of usable habitat. But you have a lot of these that occur in grasslands. Grasslands are one of the ecosystems that is most threatened. You look across North America, really when you look across the world. So just the fundamental loss of that critical landscape and the resources it provides. But there are a lot of birds, a lot of seabirds that are on this list as well. And you think, well, we haven't taken away the seawater. We haven't taken away the places where these birds go. What has happened in a lot of these cases is we've seen a decline in the resources that those waters and those habitats provide. And there could be a number of reasons for that. In some cases, you can point to things like warming seas and warming waters that are shifting the distribution of some of their prey resources, some of their food. And so we're seeing some cases it may be a shift in their food resources, and others it may just be a fundamental decline in the availability of those food resources across their entire range. There are also some species that are vulnerable to sort of fishing bycatch, so some more direct mortality events that are causing the declines. There are some species that are inherently small in population size and that are vulnerable to a variety of threats. There are a number of shorebirds on the tipping point species, and they use coastlines, they use mudflats, but they also migrate to areas in Central and South America where they may not be offered as many protections from exploitation as they are in North America. The loss and degradation of habitat is the overwhelming cause of the declines for these birds that we see on the tipping point species list. There's a number of other causes that aren't directly related to a loss of habitat. And so that's one of the reasons that it makes it a bit complicated to figure out how to reverse some of these trends, because some of them have to be addressed on an individual basis. So it's not like we can just say, well, it's all habitat, and we need to figure out how to put more habitat on the landscape. In some cases, they are affected by, and the resources they depend upon are affected by changing environmental conditions, and those are more difficult to deliver conservation solutions for. It's a very diverse list of birds that have a complex list of threats that are contributing to their decline. Some of these including aerial insectivores. We could probably point to the use of pesticides in some of the areas they occupy that are affecting the abundance of insects and other food resources that they depend upon. It's a wide variety of threats that are affecting these birds.
Luckily, a ton of information included in the State of the Birds report was collected by the public, by people like you, eBird users who create digital lists of the birds they identify at their bird feeders or along their favorite nature trails, folks who took part in a Christmas bird count, and even people who volunteered with their state wildlife agency to conduct breeding bird surveys helped compile this information.
If you're interested in contributing to the science, investigate breeding bird survey, Christmas bird count, and eBird. See if there's a way that you can contribute to collecting data that will be used to help us understand bird populations and conserve bird populations into the future. Join one or more conservation organizations that fits your view of the world and why it is that you're enthusiastic about birds. I would also say, buy a duck stamp. Don't have to be a waterfowl hunter to buy a duck stamp. 98 cents out of every dollar spent on the duck stamp goes directly to conserving, protecting key migratory bird habitats. A lot of that goes to the prairies where you're conserving, permanently protecting through voluntary easements, grasslands and wetlands, and just helping introduce other people to birds, whether through whatever means you enjoy that. If it's bird watching, if it's hunting, do your part to help facilitate somebody else's connection to birds and bird conservation.
While you might have assumed that we were going to talk about the impact of climate change on bird populations next, you'd be incorrect. The most significant thing impacting birds right now is actually funding. According to the Wildlife Society, the Trump administration requests the following cuts in the fiscal year 2026 budget. U.S. National Parks operations, minus $900 million. U.S. Geological Surveys, investigations, and research, minus $564 million. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Ecological Services, minus $37 million. U.S. Fish and Wildlife state, tribal, and non-governmental organizational grants, minus $170 million. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and rangeland research, except for forest inventory and analysis, minus $300 million. Natural Resources Conservation Service private lands conservation operations, minus $754 million. And Bureau of Land Management conservation programs, minus $198 million. While these cuts haven't been finalized, the broader message here is that conservation isn't worth spending money on.
What we already know, as reported by Field and Streams, is the Department of Government Efficiency has cut both veteran and new employees tasked with monitoring the annual waterfowl survey. But DOJ and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will not provide exact numbers. This includes both experienced pilot biologists, which is a rare expertise, and the infrastructure that supports this survey operation. According to Discover Wild Science, I quote, "Without adequate staffing and funding, the survey faces challenges in maintaining aircraft, renewing electronic subscriptions, and conducting cross-border operations requiring Canadian visas," end quote. These surveys are required by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to set our annual waterfowl seasons. This has implications for hunters because Fish and Wildlife Service controls migratory bird hunting seasons. If the agency can no longer measure how many woodcock, mourning doves, ducks, and geese there are, how can they set seasons and species limits? Furthermore, how can we as a hunting community claim we use scientific-based management?
Logan Clark is a PhD student who has studied dusky grouse and migratory songbirds. In a recent Project Upland article titled, "Why Losing Funding for Songbird Science Would Hurt All Bird Species," Logan wrote that, quote, "Under the Trump administration's fiscal year 2026 budget proposal, funding for U.S. Geological Survey's Ecosystem Mission Area, or EMA, would be cut by 90%, dropping from $293 million to $29 million. That cut alone would eliminate 1,000 staff, or about 80% of the EMA workforce, which is almost entirely biologists, technicians, and data analysts. And for what? that $264 million in savings represents just 0.014% of the current $1.9 trillion federal budget deficit, the amount the government is projected to overspend in a single fiscal year. In other words, gutting nearly all federal wildlife science would have virtually no impact on balancing the budget, but would carry enormous consequences for conservation and management across the country. End quote.
I like to think the recent pushback against the public land sale was not an anomaly, and that we as the public can bring that same energy to our elected officials and tell them that scientific management and research do not just matter to us, it is imperative to the future of our lifestyle.
Well, so I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for birds. They have kind of defined who I am and how I've lived my life, and it defined kind of how my wife and I sort of care for our property. We have purple martins, we have barn swallows, aerial insectivores, those birds that fly around and eat mosquitoes and other kind of flying insects. Are absolutely just fascinating and charismatic. I mean, obviously I grew up hunting. My exposure to birds came through waterfowl and waterfowl hunting. I am hopeful for bird populations in North America because people love birds.
If you've enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to our Patreon. There, you'll find our full-length interview with biologist Dr. Mike Brasher, links to resources we used to create this episode, and more behind-the-scenes content. As a small business and independent storytellers, your support means everything to us. After all, these are your stories.
This episode was produced by myself, Gabby Zaldumbide, A.J. DeRosa, and Jennifer Wapensky. The editing of this episode was done by myself and A.J. DeRosa. Special thanks to Dr. Mike Brasher, a certified wildlife biologist and a senior waterfowl scientist with Ducks Unlimited.